Hi, you are at Real Turkey Channel, and I'm your presenter Atilla Yeşilada, who wants to become Professor Daron Acemoglu when he grows up. Yes, Daron Acemoglu has become the third Turkish person to receive a Nobel Prize. He and two of his collaborators received the Nobel Prize in Economics a couple of days ago. Um, his contributions to institutional economics and how nations develop or fail to do so have been seminal. A very influential economist, most quoted in other academic papers. This story has three parts. First, a few personal anecdotes because I know Daron. Two, certain aspects of Daron Acemoglu's theory. By the way, they're not his theories. John Robinson has collaborated with him for over 20 years, as well as another gentleman whose name I keep forgetting. With all due respect to them, I'm just going to say Daron Acemoglu. Uh, his contribution to economic theory, the parts that interest me because in the final section, I'm going to apply it to the Turkish economy. In my view, with all due respect to Daron, he may or may not agree, the development of Turkey since Mr. Erdogan came to power in 2003 through the present day, to me, is the perfect example of how institutions determine how fast or how well a society develops. Before I start, two important definitions. First, for the layman or person, growth and economic development or societal development are synonyms. Growth is increase in per capita GDP. Development is first of all shared prosperity. So the trickle-down theory must work. Secondly, it's not only economics, but it sort of tries to explain or measure the again, for lack of a better word, development of society, its institutions, its individuals in terms of their intelligence, their health, their lifespan, their contribution toward literature, arts, science, etc., etc. Wealth, in some sense, in the broadest sense of the definition. Two, democracy, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. In Acemoglu's work, democracy is not just competitive races and people going to the ballot booth every 2 or 4 years. It is a mechanism, it's a superstructure that includes the Congress in the United States example, the presidency, the judiciary, but also regulatory institutions, NGOs, freedom of speech, freedom of press, and a well-functioning free market economy. Now, one final conjecture. Such a democracy, as idealized as it may be, is neither necessary nor sufficient for sustainable development. But Acemoglu and his colleagues have proven econometrically that democracies defined as such traditionally can sustain their growth longer than others and do perform better on a lot of metrics, such as, per capita GDP, etc. I think his works needs to be broadened in the area of other indices that measure prosperity or human development, but that's another story. Now, the personal anecdotes. In my past life, I was a PhD level economist. I got my master's degree in economics from University of California, Santa Barbara. Then I worked on my PhD for 6 years, no, 4 years at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy. In fact, I wrote a dissertation on the application of Hyman Minsky's fragility hypothesis to American commercial banking, but I never published it. I just knew then that I wasn't a good economist and I wasn't going to teach at universities. So I do know a few things about economics and economic theory. I met Daron in 2003, when I was a presenter at a regional cable station, and he was about to be the guest in the next program. We chatted briefly, and then we discovered that we have a lot of mutual friends. And since then, we have been together on numerous occasions. In fact, one of my very rare academic contributions to the world, we collaborated on this book, Turkish Economy at Crossroads. He and another colleague of mine, Murat Uçer, wrote a chapter. I wrote a different chapter, but we did communicate together. In fact, incidentally, I was with him and a couple of friends a couple of days before he received the Nobel Prize. We talked about the real exchange rate for about an hour. Believe me, you don't want to hang out with economists. They're boring people. So what is Daron Acemoglu's contribution to economic theory and practice that he was awarded with the prestigious Nobel Prize? He emphasized the role of institutions in guiding an economy through the path of development. He makes a distinction between two types of institutions: inclusive institutions, or some others would call it institutions that produce positive externalities, and exclusive institutions that do exactly the opposite, that steal resources from the rest of the economy or that disrupt efficient distribution or allocation of resources across the economy. Another point, which he was criticized for not addressing, was that the starting point of an analysis of a country may be a perfect democracy, but over time it must evolve to deal with changing conditions. Because, in particular, when you couple a democracy, popular vote, popular franchise, with a free market where people can get as rich as possible as they want to if they have the skills and abilities, uh, and they should be constantly regulated. The most democracies over time tend to slip either into authoritarianism or a rot, where institutions become outdated and no longer serve the purpose of the economy. Now, China is a very interesting example of Daron Acemoglu's theory, because in an academic paper, he clearly says, he and John Robinson, I believe, say, at the first stages of development, the political regime and institutions really don't matter that much. You could have a king, you could have a military dictatorship, simply because at the early stages of an economy's journey through time, all you need to do is get people out of villages or farms, put them into the cities, put them in a factory, they produce, voila, you got higher per capita GDP growth. In Turkey's case, this happened in the 1980s. Urbanization suddenly took on thanks to the President Özal, and textiles, tourism, and food processing became major exporting industries. And then we built on top of that. But I think once a country becomes a medium income or middle income country, then institutions become very important. It is very important then to make people stakeholders in the state and how an economy or a government or a country is governed, because their productivity matters. And if individuals are unhappy or if they feel they are not represented in the institutions that determine their fates, they don't produce. They either leave the country or, tune out of the system. So that's the gist of Daron Acemoglu's theory. Okay, I gave the example of China. China grew very rapidly after Mao's death and the demise of the Gang of Four. It neither had democracy nor free markets, you might say, which is not entirely true. It certainly never had democracy in a traditional sense, but there were competing factions in the Communist Party. So ideas actually clashed, and there was a lot of synergy between these different factions in terms of generating good policies. Two, China adopted some of the main tenets of free market economics, in particular at the coastal region, such as property rights, such as the right to get rich, which is very important, and you're not allowed to do that in communist countries. The prediction that Acemoglu and friends make is that Chinese rapid development phase is over because Xi Jinping has become the sole decision maker, eliminating all his rivals and competing ideas in the party. And day by day, he's moving China away from the free market principles. So time will tell whether he's right, but I believe he's right. If you want to build a high technology society, you have to reward people who innovate, like Alibaba, Tencent, and numerous others. They've innovated, they've become successful, owners have become rich, and the companies have amassed huge amount of economic and political power. Now, Xi Jinping de facto nationalized these companies. So no one in China really has an incentive to do the same thing because they know the fruits of their labor will simply be confiscated by the Communist Party. United States is at the other end of the spectrum. United States has a fairly well-functioning free market, good regulatory institutions, but it is in a political coma. The rules established by the founding fathers about the election of the president, the division of powers between the Senate and the lower house, no longer works. For instance, the filibuster essentially kills majority vote. The strange system of the electoral college is open to interpretation. More importantly, the way United States elects its presidential candidates have become dysfunctional, in my view, in the sense that generation after generation, it produces more radical or populist leaders. Trump, in my view, is an example of that. So once again, while the United States is rich, and some experts such as UBS claim the next decade will belong to the United States, I think that's open to question in the sense that using Daron Acemoglu and his friend John Robinson's words, United States may step out of the narrow corridor through which a democracy creates high levels of development. Okay, so this is as much as you need to know, or I need to tell you about Daron Acemoglu's theories. Let's apply these to Turkey under Erdogan. I divide the Erdogan reign into two episodes. The first is from 2003 to roughly 2012, when nationwide Gezi protests took over. This was the rise of modern Turkey. Since then, Turkey has lost a lot. It still grows, but the quality of growth is poor, and I think I've expressed in my past videos that the Turkish Statistics Agency overestimates Turkish growth rate. Income distribution has become much worse. The Gini coefficient has increased. In fact, you really don't need data to see that since roughly 2012, Turkey has regressed. Simply ask the people. The youth, for instance, 78% of whom want to migrate to another country, simply because they don't think there is any hope for them in Turkey's future. That by itself is very telling. So what happened? Can Daron Acemoglu's theories explain why Turkey had a brief shining moment for a decade and then suddenly imploded or slowly imploded? I think it can. First, democracy started from zero after the 2001 crisis. Turkey had democracy since 1946, competitive elections, and the institutions that go with it, such as, the parliament auditing the prime minister and the judiciary superseding both, etc. But the 2001 crisis wiped out the ancient regime. People didn't want to vote the politicians who made them suffer that devastating calamity. Turkey started from T equals zero. AKP was the new Red Queen of Turkey. And AKP was bound by external and internal rules to behave in a predictable way and a productive way. Externally, we were under an IMF standby. We could go bankrupt in a minute if we didn't get loans from IMF. So that constrained governmental behavior. Two, Turkey was given the hope of eventual EU membership. Turks have a lot of different ideologies, religions, views on how the country ought to be governed, but membership of EU became holy grail, all the way from the authoritarian army to Turkey's outcasts, Kurds. Everyone agreed that it's a good thing and we should work for it cooperatively. Internally, the judiciary was still under the sway of the ultra-secularist and interventionist Turkish military. And Turkish military indeed threatened to take over the reins of the country from AKP several times. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it constrains behavior. And AKP's response to these was itself to become an inclusive institution. It drew votes and intellectuals from secularists, from Atatürkists, Kemalists, from social democrats, from Islamists, simply because they thought AKP was the only legitimate hope to get us to EU membership and to higher levels of prosperity. Thanks to IMF and EU, Turkey built several institutions. Actually, institution building started with Kemal Dervish, a famous World Bank executive who recently passed away. He was economy czar for a while. He passed legislation to grant the Turkish Central Bank autonomy. Turkey's regulatory structure was established under him, and budgetary management became very transparent and efficient. There were other reforms such as privatization, the competitiveness, and the transparency of public tenders, etc. But I don't want to waste your time. AKP inherited that rich heritage and developed it. So much so that, in my view, one of the most important aspects of a society's development is that by 2010 or so, there was no abuse towards prisoners. In most developing countries, mistreating and abusing prisoners is a common fact of life, and Turkey has a very, very dirty past. Communists, Kurds, even social democrats were persecuted under the military tutelage. That all ended by 2010. Economically, Turkey has a growth spurt exceeding 5% per annum in terms of GDP. And it was high quality growth in the sense that total factor productivity increased sometimes by 5 percentage points a year, which means each year the same amount of workers and the same amount of fixed capital produced ever more. We imported technology. We imported management skills. There was a hope. There was this hope which drives United States today, that if I work hard, I can get rich, and my children and grandchildren could be in a better place than where I am right now. Upward social mobility. AKP also in itself was more democratic in the sense that Erdogan wasn't the sole leader. He was one of the four founders, and the others had an equal say in decision making. There were a lot of notable names with their own constituencies who at times defied Erdogan for good reasons if he was making a mistake. Turkey's decline actually started with the financial crises of 2007, 2008, but no one noticed because the crisis was so severe that no country had best practice policies. You're trying to save your life. It doesn't matter whether you generate huge budget deficits or not. But the breaking point came somewhere around the Gezi protests, where Erdogan decided that a popular democracy wasn't a good idea for his reign. Other things happened too. The then German and French leaders, Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Sarkozy, told Turkey in no uncertain terms that no matter what we did, because of our Muslim vocation, Asiatic vocation, we'll never become EU members. So the Red Queen disappeared. There was really no strange attractor that drew the entire society, and Turkey's old fault lines re-expressed themselves. The army was liquidated by Byzantine conspiracies. They were accused of plotting coups, and fake documents were produced. The institution or the organization which committed that crime, Fethullah Gülen's disciples. Fethullah Gülen, by the way, Turkey's number one nemesis, passed away today. May he rest in hell. But he essentially conspired. And I don't think, without the full knowledge of Erdogan, to discredit the army. Look, putting a few generals in prison or firing them doesn't really faze me. It's probably a good thing. We should do that more often. But that started the first wave of persecution in Turkey. Erdogan used the threat or the fear of an army takeover among the Islamist conservatives to liquidate or purge a lot of the secularist class, a lot of the socialists, essentially a lot of people who might cause trouble to him down the line. And then, after the Gezi protests, Turkey has only two men and no one else that made decisions, Erdogan and Fethullah Gülen. Needless to say, like it had happened in the French Revolution, Gülen revolted against Erdogan. It got really ugly, but Gülen was so maniacal that he organized or inspired a coup with the help of certain elements in the Turkish armed forces. Once again, the people and the rest of the Turkish armed forces suppressed this coup in 2016, but that too gave Erdogan the opportunity to purge large segments of institutions. NGOs were no longer looked upon kindly. Anyone who dared to oppose Erdogan was accused of being a member of the Gülenist organization. The rest of the founding fathers retired or were kicked away. Moreover, as it happens inevitably in all of these countries with a strongman regime, all the institutions were hollowed out. They no longer served the constitution and the public interest. They served Erdogan and AKP. Moreover, since the state no longer carried out its essential functions of protecting its citizens, doling out justice, providing security, etc., mafia filled the gap. Corruption became endemic. Mr. Erdogan realized early on, more than any other Turkish politician, that you need money to win elections. And how do you get that money? Well, very simple. You nurture a small group of businesses who are slavishly devoted to you. You give them plum, state contracts and public tenders at high prices, and part of their profits go back to AKP's coffers. Rumor has it Erdogan stole too. I really don't know. We'll find out after he retires. But the fact is, an idea that features prominently in Daron Acemoglu's work, that of a corrupt elite that confiscates or usurps the resources of society, has become rampant. And that was a very exclusionary institution itself, in the sense that honest business people, those who weren't members of AKP or who didn't go to the same mosques, could never get decent state contracts. The same thing happened in civil service. Competitive exams were essentially eliminated, and anyone who was a member of a Sunni tariqat in the United States, that would be a church, like the Presbyterian Church, uh, could easily enter civil service without any qualifications or skills. That too became an exclusionary institution. And finally, the judiciary. The judiciary became a robot that followed instructions or orders from Erdogan. As a result, we have seen Turkish growth slow down, not substantially. But as I've said, I think growth figures are overestimated. Over the 2012 to 2023, officially Turkey grew around 4.5%. I think it's more like 3%, but let's leave that aside. One thing is very obvious and easily verifiable by data. Turkey's FDI fell to almost zero. No one wanted to bring technology. Turkey's capex to GDP ratio declined by about 10%. Brain drain started and accelerated, and income inequality became an endemic problem. Thanks to Erdogan's bizarre monetary policies, such as to lower inflation, you need to lower the interest rate. Turkish inflation and currency instability reared their ugly heads. Today, despite efforts of Mehmet Şimşek, Turkey still has 50% official inflation. According to national polls, people think it's 93%. Okay. This is a very sad story. I don't think there is any country in the 21st century which rose so rapidly to prominence under the same man and then lost everything because that same man changed his behavior. There are a lot of countries which were once rich or on the path to prosperity, which were befallen by wars, natural calamities, other disasters, etc. But none of these happened in Turkey. The only variable that explains Turkey's high-quality growth spurt until 2012 and then the slow demise afterwards is Erdogan's behavior and the institutions he created and destroyed. It's a sad story, but it has a hopeful ending. Turkey can still get back to narrow corridor. I don't think Erdogan will ever change. But eventually he will retire. No one lives forever. Even if AKP remains in power, his successor is not going to be as powerful as Erdogan. Erdogan is the GOAT of Turkish politicians, greatest of all time. People like Erdogan come once in a century. Anyone else will have to share power either with other people in his party or with the opposition or with other institutions of the state and the society. Turkey, there is something called muscle memory. If you train, your muscles grow. Then for some reason you stop training. You got sick or you got bored, etc. Your muscles start weakening again. That's called detraining. But once you go back to the gym, your muscles remember how to grow. And you make up your losses much more rapidly than the first time you try to increase your muscle size. Turkey has that muscle memory. We still have civil servants, judges, prosecutors, business people who effectively worked in Turkey's bright period. They are now on the sidelines, or they hide their identities and change their behavior simply because doing their best is not what maximizes their welfare. The institutional capacity is there. And, Turks are hardworking people. I think, according to OECD stats, Turkey has the longest or the third longest working hours among member countries. We have a diverse selection of export industries. The brain drain would probably come back, and the youth will regain hope in Turkey's future. So one day I think Turkey will get back to the center stage. It might be too late for me to see it, but I'm hopeful for my son, my daughter-in-law, and my two grandchildren. I want to thank you for watching this this lengthy video. I hope I've been able to convey Daron Acemoglu's and his colleagues' views without huge mistakes. These are all my interpretations of his views, and if I've made mistakes, I am the one who is solely responsible. This is Atilla Yeşilada saying goodbye from Istanbul. You just watched the video by Real Turkey channel.